Frank, welcome to Wealth Talk today. Good to have you on.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, glad to be here, mate.
So, Frank, we are in interesting times at the moment. There's obviously lots of discussion been going on all year, but we would love to get your thoughts and opinions today on, why right now is a good time to be looking at investing in property in the UK, especially. But before we do that, would you mind just giving our listeners a little bit of background as to yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I was a secondary school science teacher. I finished that in 2007 and decided I wanted to work full-time in property. So I went and got myself a job as an estate agent, commission only. 6 weeks later, decided I'd actually start my own estate agency and opened the doors in November 2007, which if your memory goes back that far, probably the worst month in a decade to open an estate agency, given that the credit crunch really bit in December 2007. So yeah, baptism of fire really in 2008, but escaped bankruptcy by the skin of my teeth. I'd opened an office opposite Savills, city centre, Nottingham, NG1. Couldn't have been worse timing, worse decision making. But realised that there was a niche for helping investors to build portfolios, and that's what kept us alive. In 2009, we did 26 transactions. We were buying the properties ourselves, we were refurbishing them, we were tenanting them, and then we were selling them on. In fact, I think it was the Daily Telegraph came and they sent a couple of guys up to interview us and photograph me and my business partner, and they did like a half-page spread on a success story in the depths of a recession. They decided they wanted a good news story, unusually. So we had a pretty good year in 2009 and then continued to build on that. I got to about 5 years ago, and I was just flipping a few properties a year. I was working 3 days a week. I was taking 15 weeks holidays some years. I was earning a really solid 120 grand a year, and realised I was quite bored. I just repeated the same year a few times over. My business partner and I had gone separate ways in 2010, and I just carried on. I built myself a decent portfolio. I've got at that point, I think I had about 45 properties, and realised that actually I know sometimes it sounds a bit arrogant, like a lot of people want freedom of location, freedom of time, and financial freedom. Well, I kind of had all three. I couldn't not work for a month. I had to work, but I'd gone from working 70, 80 hours a week to working 30 hours a week over 3 days. It felt like I was on holiday, a 4-day weekend, most weekends. But I was bored, and I realized that there was something missing. And I really did some soul searching and realized that I needed a purpose. I needed a passion. And I thought back to my time at university. I grew up in West Wales, but I went to university in Nottingham. And I was really shocked when I went to Nottingham about the level of homelessness. I'd not really seen homeless people living in West Wales. Like, my nearest town was a 20-minute drive away. My nearest nightclub was 45 minutes away. I hadn't seen a lot of homeless people. I'd been to London and Swansea and stuff and seen people on the streets. But in Nottingham, they seem to be everywhere. Like, on my cycle ride to university each day, I'd see the same homeless people on the street, and we'd go out to drinking of an evening, and there'd be people sat next to ATMs, and I just wasn't used to. It was a real shock to my system. I hadn't been immunized against it. I hadn't become used to it. And so that really niggled at me when I was at university. In fact, I'd come up with this idea. My best mate at uni, Adrian, his dad had passed away when he was doing his A-levels, and he bought a house very sensibly with his inheritance. He bought a house, and I lived in the house with him and two other mates, four of us. So we had a bit of a nicer house than your typical student house. And we had a garage. And I remember talking to them about, how about we interview a homeless person and they come and live in our garage. We'll make it into like a bedroom, and we'll take them to a charity shop and buy them some clothes, and we'll write them a CV, and we'll help them get a job, and then they can go rent their own place and we can do it again. And I got really excited about this extracurricular housing project. They were less excited because they didn't like the idea of someone having keys to the house while we left all our laptops and bikes in the house all day. So it never happened. But when I got to this soul searching point, so I was around, how old would I have been? I've been just turned 30. I was, maybe it's a bit young for a midlife crisis, but I just started thinking, what's going to give me more meaning? I'm providing for my family. I've got kids now. How am I going to jump out of bed with a bit of a spring in my step? Because I was a bit flat. And I thought back to that housing people that I'd never done. And at any one point, we've got empty houses, we've got a void for a few weeks, or we've just bought something that we're refurbishing. And I started really thinking about that. And we kicked off the Stepping Stones housing project, which I thought that would be a really good way of housing lots of homeless people. And then so from that came Ethical Property Partners, whereby I figured if I could help other people, I've got two ways of housing. I want to end homelessness globally, and I'm proud to shout it from the rooftops. I sometimes get sniggered at that, that's a very lofty ambition. But if you don't shoot for the stars, what's the point? And if my kids carry on my legacy, then that's great. But I thought to myself, I've got two options. I can either become Warren Buffett, Bill Gates level of wealthy and donate to ending homelessness, and I quite frankly didn't back myself to get to that level of wealth. And so and the bad thing about that is, in order to get to that level of wealth, you have to compound, which means you don't help people in the meantime. If you look at both of those, they've created their foundations and their philanthropic work very late in their careers, and so if you never get there, you actually don't help anyone, which didn't appeal. So, and I'm not knocking what they've done. It's phenomenal, the charitable work that both of those individuals have done. So what I looked at is, how could I help people to replicate my relatively low level of success, but my level of financial freedom, etc., so that they could start giving back to their communities and housing the homeless. And that's where I came up with a property franchise. There are very few around that help you to invest in your own portfolio. There's only one other that I'm aware of, and we have done that for the last 5 years. So we're now at 70 franchisees across 4 countries, and are expanding. We've just sold the rights to Australia. We're in negotiation with America at the moment. We've got active franchisees in Ireland, Wales, and England now. And so I'm really proud to say that we've just exceeded 150,000 nights where a homeless person has slept in one of our beds rather than on the streets or sofa surfing. And so, if I'm honest, I'm very proud to say that is the realization of a dream from 20 years ago, and it's growing every single month. More people are doing stepping stones on the franchise, and we're housing more and more people every night. So that's a very quick, maybe a bit longer than you thought, but a very quick press of my last 15 years in property, something like that.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that achievement, Frank. That really is something to be proud of. And obviously, we talk about multiple pillars at WealthBuilders, holistic. So, on a personal note there, you're building a business around property pillar, the business pillar, creating IP, which is fantastic. But, of course, I can see from the way you talk, it's really, it's driven by your desire to help and really have an impact, and talk about different freedoms there, freedom of, really being able to give back and make a difference, which is commendable. So, Frank, we want to talk really today as well, using your experience, of why someone should be thinking about investing right now in the UK, and perhaps some of your thoughts as to the best ways to be approaching that, because there's so many different strategies within property. It can cause overwhelm sometimes with people, and they can spin around and not necessarily make the progress that they want to. So what would be your advice for someone maybe at the beginning of their journey, but also many of our listeners who are already very involved in property, some of the things that they should be looking out for as we approach a recession, or even are in a recession right now?
We're in a recession, but without the customary housing drop. We haven't seen that yet. It's a very unusual situation where we're seeing a housing bubble at the start of a recession. In fact, in my lifetime, I don't think there's ever been a situation quite like this where we know there's a crash coming, but we're actually in a really buoyant part of the market. It's amazing to be able to. So we've sold. I've never sold so many properties so quickly. I've sold. I think I'm just selling my fourth in as many months, and it's because I'm getting top dollar for my properties. It makes complete sense to sell because I'll be able to buy. Well, conservative estimates are that in 12 months' time, property prices will be at 15% lower than they currently are. If you look at RICS projections, the government's own projections, there are the odd newspaper that's saying it's going up and up and up. But if you look at the underlying economics, it doesn't really look possible. Now, anything's possible, but I don't think it really is likely that house prices are higher in 12 months' time than they are today, when you look at the perfect storm of what's happening. And I won't bore the listeners with the economics, but we've got furlough ending, or very, very restricted furlough commencing in November. So you've got furlough ending this month for the vast majority of people. So employers have got to decide, are they actually bringing these people back or not? So we're going to see mass unemployment. In my opinion, the fact that you get £1,000 more in January if you keep people on, it's a bit of a joke. You've got VAT has been postponed until next year. You've got corporation tax has been postponed until next year. You've got the stamp duty holiday ending in March. There's a lot of things that are happening. You've got bounce back loans, coronavirus loans, the bounce back loans, and then the larger CBILS loans they were, weren't they? All the interest on those is starting to be paid next year. So 2021 is going to be a really tough year for the safety net and the support that was put in place ending. At the same time, the government have got to raise taxes. They've got to start recouping this money. We had the autumn budget cancelled, understandably. The government didn't want to introduce more uncertainty into a very uncertain climate. That's going to kick off. I anticipate capital gains tax going up. I anticipate quite a lot of taxes going up, actually. So there's going to be this perfect storm next year. I don't think we can get away from the macroeconomics of house prices coming down. People will not be able to pay their mortgages. Many people, businesses going under, employees being made redundant, and at the same time mortgage lenders are already, we've seen this the last 3, 4, 5 weeks, already becoming far more stringent on their lending. So people won't be able to refinance, people won't be able to purchase as easily. If there's less purchasers and more sellers, prices come down. We're in a bit of an artificial bubble right now. There's loads of people that are buying on emotion because they didn't enjoy lockdown in their current home. So they didn't enjoy lockdown. They want an extra bedroom. They want an extra piece of garden. And so they're buying with not a lot of consideration for long-term affordability. So I think we're in a unique position, Christian, of being able to see a crash coming and getting ourselves ready to invest in it. Those two types of people that you just mentioned, the experienced property investors and the less experienced, I think should approach that situation in two very different ways. Let me rephrase that. Where someone is now is not actually that important. It's where they're going. So Stephen Covey says, start with the end in mind. Where does that investor want to end up? That's the important thing. And the destination is a sophisticated investor that has built a significant portfolio for themselves, and they are in property as an active investor, as one of their occupations, maybe not full time, but 15 hours, 20 hours a week or something. If that's an end point, then they should be approaching this recession and this housing crash in a very specific way, which I have. However, if the other destination is their current business, or they're happy with their current employment and they just want to add property as an asset class, so they don't want to be massively active, they just want to have money in property and have the leverage that property gives them, then they should approach this recession in a very different way. So those are the two. That's the first decision for someone to make. In 5 years' time, where are they going to be? Are they going to be active, sophisticated, running a property business, if you want to call it that, or are they just going to have some passive property investments? That's the first decision I would start with.
You talked about obviously the outlook for 2021 and lots of things coming to a head, which could make the landscape pretty messy and difficult for a lot of people. And we talk about opportunities here now, not in a way that is taking advantage. And of course, in the very name of your company, Ethical Property Partners, there's a way to create a win-win. Frank, can you talk about some of the ways that someone can, help someone who's maybe in a bit of a distressed situation, so that there's benefit for both sides and both come out on top?
Absolutely, and I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions about property investing or sophisticated property investing. And I think that misconception is that it's somehow predatory, it's somehow taking advantage of people. It can be, and the industry has a reputation for that, and I think the reputation is deserved on the whole. We've called ourselves Ethical Property Partners just deliberately to disassociate ourselves from people that do this business wrong. And so we have 42 documented scenarios whereby people sell property to us, and it can be anything from they've got a business opportunity and they need quick cash to be able to capitalize on that business opportunity. It can be someone who's emigrating for work purposes. It can be someone who's inherited a property that they weren't expecting and they just want whatever money they can get for it. It can be someone who's in negative equity, so they can't sell on the open market, but we can buy from them over a period of time and clear their mortgage for them. It can be someone who can't pay their mortgage and is in danger of repossession. We've been to court and helped people to halt repossessions in order to buy from them. So we're always looking at every person involved in a transaction benefiting. So if we've put a transaction together, even if we're not buying it, we need to be paid for our time. We need to be providing a quality service to the vendor, whether we're buying over time, whether we're buying at a discount. They need to be getting value for the equity that they're paying us in, or the flexibility they're paying us in. An investor, if they're lending money or if they're buying the property, they need to get really good value. And of course, the final end user of the property, whether it's a homeless person, whether it's a family renting the property, whether it's someone having a holiday and a holiday let, all of those stakeholders need to be getting value from it. It's very important, Christian. And
when we are in a difficult time, a recession, are there additional checks or things that people should be thinking about when they're purchasing property to make sure they're buying safely?
You need to be recession proofing your investments. So by that, there's two ways of losing money in property. The first is if you buy wrong. So if you buy in the wrong area, if you buy at the wrong price, that's the first way you can lose money in property. The second way is if you have to sell in a hurry. So if you make sure that your investment is cash flowing positively for you, then you're not going to ever have to sell it. You can pick when you sell the property. So long as you buy in the right area, the right type of property with the right monetization strategy where there is a demand for it. I was just sat with a couple about an hour ago. They're buying their fourth property. They're doing it as an armchair investment. We're building their portfolio for them over time. And they asked me about student property. And I said, I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. I have never bought student property in the UK. And they asked me why. And the reason for that is I cannot predict over the long term the demand for student accommodation in any particular city. Now, if you look at cities around the country, universities have built masses of purpose-built accommodation. Well, supply and demand just means that your 3-bed terrace that you were letting out to 4 students is going to have less students wanting to rent it now that they've built. My university in Nottingham, they built 1,600 one-bedroom flats over the course of like a year. Well, that knocks out 400 4-bedroom houses from the private rented sector. And so I wouldn't touch student accommodation because I can't control how successful or unsuccessful a university is going to be. I can't control whether students from China continue to come to university here or not, and I can't control if the university builds loads of accommodation. So it's about picking investments that have multiple monetization streams that are very, very safe moving forwards. People often look at my transactions and go, wow, you're really high risk, you're really sophisticated. But actually, I use my sophistication to be really safe. I'm actually a very risk averse investor. And you look at some of the compounding strategies that I use. So we might use 8 or 9 strategies on a single transaction. But if they didn't work, what people sometimes miss is that might be plan B. Plan A might not have worked. Plan B worked amazingly, but I also had plan C, D, and E, and plan E still made me money. A mentor of mine used to say, heads we win and tails we don't lose. And that's a really good rule to live by in sophisticated property investing. Yeah.
And of course, making sure that you've got the right education. We talked a bit about this, Frank. I know you're an avid reader, and education is obviously key to anyone who's getting into property, and even a new strategy. You need to understand the asset before investing your money.
Absolutely. And so I've studied real estate, as they call it in the rest of the world, in Australia, in America, and taken what we can use here. I've looked at how commercial property investors use financial tools, etc., and applied those to residential property here. And I've had numerous mentors. The key thing for me is, and let's go back to those two, that person who's got two routes, okay? One where they want to become an involved, sophisticated investor, and the other where they just want to hold passive property investments. I think sometimes the two get confused. So people go on to a free webinar and they hear about the glitzy next strategy, which might be service accommodation, or it might be rent to rent, or it might be whatever snake oil they're selling for their $3,000 course. But there's nothing wrong with that. We use all those strategies. We use service accommodation, we use holiday lets, we use rent to rent. There's nothing wrong with the strategies, but it's the misapplication of those strategies. So the person who just wants 5 buy-to-lets in 5 years' time to be producing an income for them to supplement their income, where they want to spend 1 hour a quarter, that person shouldn't be looking at any of those strategies. Those are time-intensive strategies, high monetization. You quadruple your profits for sure on service accommodation, for example, but that strategy doesn't suit that person. That person doesn't want to spend 10, 20 hours a week learning that strategy, because that's what it takes to properly learn a strategy. You have to really apply yourself, you have to practice it, you probably want a mentor there to hold your hand, and you're going to make mistakes. The first, second, third deal are going to be mediocre or perhaps poor, and then you're going to get better. So if someone's only wanting 5 investments, they're far better keeping it simple, doing single AST properties, so single lets. Bread and butter housing is what we talk about, not necessarily spending loads of time and energy trying to get below market value, because they are focusing their time on being a really good employee or being a really good business owner. And so they're happy to put in a 25% deposit. Like the couple that came to me earlier today, they're in that first category where they're just wanting some highly leveraged properties. And when I say highly leveraged properties, I mean time leverage. They said, how much time will I need to spend on this property? And I said, if you sit down for half an hour a quarter to check your numbers and check that it's all going to plan, and perhaps call your letting agent, which is us, call us to ask any questions, that will be ample, because we're doing everything else for you. For them to try and learn how to do service accommodation is a ridiculous thing to do. They'll never get a return on that time. Whereas the other person who wants to be, and they're paying market value, they're putting £25,000 into a £100,000 property, but the agreement, in fact, I have it right in front of me from earlier. The agreement that they've signed is that they will pay £30,000, a maximum of £30,000. So that means they're only buying up to £120,000 property with a 75% loan to value mortgage, with a minimum net profit per month before tax of £200 a month. That's an 8% return. So it's a guaranteed minimum of 8%. Now, we can actually source at 9, 10, 11 and 12%. And I deliberately, it's a minimum agreement. So we might source them a property at £100,000 where they put in 25 and they achieve an 11% return. Well, that £25,000, and sophisticated people would go, well, that's not a very good deal. Well, it's a perfect deal for them, because that £25,000 at the moment is probably earning them less than 1% in the bank. And even if they put it in a fixed rate bond, they're going to get less than 2%, whereas they're earning 8% there after all expenses, minimum, on an ongoing basis. And over the next 5 or 10 years, I'd be amazed if that property doesn't go up in value and they get some capital growth as well. So if we see 10% capital growth over the next 5 years, that'd be very conservative. Their 100 grand properties now worth 110, but they've only put 25 grand into it. So now they've got a, whatever that is, a 40% increase in their equity as well. And so that leveraged, passive, armchair, if you want to call it, investment, it's really it's very important to be clear on it and not to beat yourself up. A lot of people, YouTube, don't never buy at market value. You're a mug if you buy at market value. Well, hang on a second. Market value is the average of what everyone pays. So how can you be a mug? That is, by very definition, the average of what a property is worth. And so if it ticks your boxes and enables you to focus on what your passion is, then it's absolutely appropriate. The flip side of that is the person that wants to have a portfolio of 20, 30 properties and wants to be very active in property. Then it's worth investing way more in the nuts and bolts of how to do it. So how do you market to motivated vendors? How do you communicate with them effectively? How do you structure these deals? Like, we've got 61 different strategies for monetizing property. Then it's worth learning that and investing in your education. Some of our franchisees are doing a transaction a month at the moment. So they're buying a property a month for themselves. That over a 3 or 5 year period will transform their net worth. So yeah, I think, Christian, it's about having the right approach for each person. Yeah, there's no one size fits all.
Interesting there as well, isn't it? It's been said before, success begins in the mind. And if you believe that opportunities are there, if you believe that you can find them and that you can be successful, then, that is the starting point.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And the number of people that come to us, so typically we'll buy at 25 to 35% below a RICS bank valuation. And the number of clients we have who don't really believe it, even when they're sat in front of the vendor, and they'll typically take a property mentor with them, and they'll sit there and they'll make the offer and they'll hold their breath, and we train them in this: just make the offer and just don't say anything. And then when the vendor actually says yes, like we had one brand new investor been with us, I think he'd been with us about 6 weeks, and he went to the vendor without a mentor, actually, which is against our best advice, and he said, I could have fallen over backwards, Frank. It was a £120,000 property. I offered 86 or something, so just over 25% discount. And she just said, yeah, that'll work. When do we start? And he said, I could have fallen on the floor, because it's that belief, it's that level of belief of this is actually possible. Because here's the thing, the actual mindset of that person and of many, many people is, I'm not worthy of that. Because what we're doing is we're selling a service. So that vendor who's selling at 85 for £120,000 property, or 86, is paying us in equity, so in a discount, for the service of buying her property quickly. And so then if you turn that around, we become a salesperson, not a purchaser. So now we're offering a service. And do we believe that our service is worth, what's that, £34,000? Do we value ourselves enough to charge someone £34,000? It's a hard question. And people go, of course I could buy a house at 30% below. But in the moment when they have to actually make the offer, they bottle it. Their intonation or the language they use, I know it's very low, but we'd only be able to offer 86. As soon as you say something like that, the vendor thinks, oh, they don't even think I should go ahead. So should I be worried? Whereas saying to them, in your situation, I understand why you need to sell very, very quickly. We can do that. We can buy this in the next 28 days for you. In order to buy that quickly, we can pay £86,000. Does that kind of figure work for you? That's very different. You can hear the confidence, you can hear the professionalism in my voice. It is fascinating. People just come to us to learn the strategies, but they leave EPP having learnt the correct mindset to work the strategies. You've hit on a very interesting point. I could talk about that for a couple of hours, Christian.
Well, Frank, I've very much enjoyed speaking with you today and hearing your outlook and your thoughts for what is probably going to be a bit of a bumpy road ahead, but it's not a road that we haven't been on before. So we can learn from the past and prepare ourselves for the future.
So can I just leave you with a final thought, Christian?
Oh, please do.
So the Chinese have a saying, and that is that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today. So if you weren't in property investing 20 years ago, my take-home message is don't procrastinate, don't delay, start investing today. And the biggest risk, I think, to property investors is not taking action. Of course, you want to do your due diligence. Of course, you want to make sure you're buying in the right area, that you've got an asset that's going to monetize for the long term. But I see far more people disappointed that they never actually got in because they were still trying to time the market than people who took action, bought property, then bought better again. And we have to remember, we live on an island. House prices go up because there's scarcity of land. And so even if house prices go down in the short term, buying now is a far better idea than trying to guess the market, because who knows? Boris just this week has said he's generation buy. He's going to bring back 95% mortgages. How short memories are. Do they not remember what happened the last time we had 95% mortgages? But who knows? Other than who knows what's going to happen in the short term. But what we do know is in the long term, property is a phenomenal investment. So if I can leave your listeners with that take home message, it's if you're considering property, don't hesitate. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. And if anyone wants to find out more about Ethical Property Partners and watch some of your videos online, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, sure. Probably our podcast is a good place to start. You can search Sophisticated Property Investing or Ethical Property Partners on all the podcast platforms. Alexa will find me. You'll hear me with my squeaky little voice. Alternatively, you can find us on YouTube, Ethical Property Partners. Those are probably the best two places to find us. Otherwise, ethicalpropertypartners.com, and you can get in touch with us, watch loads of videos about us, find out what we're all about. So, yeah.
Thank you, Frank. Great to have you on today.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks for having me.